I went through all 32 NFL teams to figure out exactly how each coach affects your fantasy football team. Today's episode, the Denver Broncos. So, take a seat, class is in session. So, we need to identify if there was any coaching changes made here. This is an entirely new coaching front. That's Sean Payton and Joe Lombardi on the offense, and Vance Joseph on the defense. A little bit of an introduction to Vance Joseph. He primarily works with defensive backs. We go over to the guys who are more intriguing to us in terms of fantasy. We're going to talk more about Joe Lombardi and Sean Payton. If you haven't theorized it yet already, their specialty is quarterbacks. Sean Payton's history goes beyond his time with the Saints. This seemed with his time with the Eagles, the Giants, the Cowboys, and his long tenure with the Saints. Joe Lombardi primarily spent his career with the Saints, but he did have a couple of stints with the Lions and the Chargers. You'll also notice upon arrival that was the season in which Justin Herbert threw for 38 touchdowns and over 5,000 yards. So outside of the coaching changes, what exactly did they do in the offseason? Well, as you saw with the coaches, they made a lot of changes as well. Remember, I categorize guys as starters who have started more than 7 games in a season. Does that mean that they're great or whatever? I have no clue. But that's the base point for why these guys are highlighted. And as you can see with this offensive line, it looks like they did a full-on clean house. As I said, I'm not an offensive line expert or anything of that sort, but it looks like they addressed some of the issues from what they're missing, but we'll see exactly how that pans out in the actual season itself. As you can see with the genius offensive minds that they have, they're going to be a more offensive-minded program. Now that we've laid the foundation for exactly how the Broncos have attacked the offseason, we can start to dive a little bit into how it affects our individual fantasy teams. But first, we need to check with the guys upstairs to see exactly how they have the Denver Broncos finishing out to give our knowledge a little bit more structure. The Broncos are currently projected to get somewhere between 8 and 9 wins and land about 3rd in their overall division. I personally want to go against consensus here, but I don't know. I'm just kind of finding new reasons each day to kind of go back and forth on the overall, is this going to work, is it not type of deal. I mean, it's not like it's going to be the easiest division in the world either. But I do think there was a couple small things that made a really big difference in this offseason that not a lot of people are talking about and really are creating a lot of value for us in terms of fantasy. We see specifically what Joe Lombardi and Sean Payton actually can do together. They create amazing quarterbacks. It's what they do. We saw the impact that Joe Lombardi had on Justin Herbert. We saw it on Drew Brees, albeit these are phenomenal talents, but at one point in time, Russell Wilson did fit in that category as well. And we can really, the only inhibitor that I personally see with this is Russell Wilson's age. And a lot of people are talking about his overall mentality and stuff like this, but there was a couple of other factors going on in his personal life that I'm not going to digress into in this video that I think affected his mental state. But another facet that I thought was quite interesting was in his contract last year, it was he had to have his own office and his own space away from everyone else, which I thought was kind of weird. And as someone that's really big on chemistry, specifically in between teams and making things work, I think that's a big discredit to everyone else on the team, and he wasn't able to connect with them as he needed to, essentially. So that's part of why I see them rising above expectations in some extent, but I could easily have this one bite me and I'd be completely wrong. I'm going to put the Denver Broncos at number 2 in the AFC West, but I think that is a little bit of a bold take here. Mainly because my concern lies within the offensive line itself. And that might even be a bad take in itself. And going off of projected wins, I have to kind of go on the more optimistic side, seeing that they're going to get probably past that 9-win mark, just because I have them going at second in this division based off of what I'm theorizing. Since it seems like everyone's on Russell Wilson being the comeback player of the year, it does make me a little bit pessimistic on kind of how things are going, but we'll see how that all plays out. It doesn't mean that he's going to be a bad quarterback in terms of fantasy. Who knows, maybe it'll create an erroneous headline down the line. We'll see how that all plays out. Now that we've got a really strong understanding of the general direction in which the Denver Broncos are built towards this season, we can dive into exactly how Sean Payton and Joe Lombardi affect our various fantasy teams. So, starting off with everyone's favorite quarterback here, Russell Wilson. I initially was thinking about putting him as a dark horse to make it for the QB1 spot, but I don't want to be that bold in my takes. From the two trends that we're seeing between Joe Lombardi and Sean Payton, it looks like that a base of a 20-point average is really safe here. Does that mean we have to see some upside from the Russell Wilson? 100%. But I think with somebody that has been there and done that before, it is most certainly possible. And it really looks like Russell Wilson and Sean Payton, at least in this offseason, were really trying to build that offseason connection, i.e. when they were spending time at those Denver Broncos games together. But I'm going to save that specific piece for a little bit later for a specific receiver that we're going to talk about in this video. So for me, I'm going to be very optimistic and say that Russell Wilson has a floor of about 20 fantasy points per game this season. And considering you can get him in the 12th and 13th round of fantasy drafts, that's an absolute steal for me. To me, it seems like this coaching staff is taking the bull by the horns and is in complete control. This is not just Broncos country. This is now Sean Payton's country. And moving over to the running back one, this is definitely an area of optimism based off the charts. An 18 fantasy point projection for someone like Javonte Williams does seem like in the realm of possibility. Just the concern is based off of the data that doesn't seem very likely. So it is very hard for me to be super optimistic about a guy like Javonte Williams coming off of an injury, and kind of the overall statistics pointing towards like him not being super relevant. I don't know. I'm going to personally err on the side of optimism for somebody like Javonte Williams. Based on Sean Payton wanting to establish the run game here, Javonte Williams seems like the only guy that's really going to truly be able to do that. Yes, we saw what Samaje Perine was able to do with the Cincinnati Bengals last year, but I'm still not going to be super optimistic about him just because of the age more than anything. But Javonte Williams also was like the top tier breakout candidate for a lot of fantasy analysts last year. So depending upon how exactly he heals from this injury, he could be a breakout candidate in year 3. And I'm going to be the guy erring on the side of optimism, projecting him 17 plus fantasy points per game. And just looking at the statistics right now, he had 12 targets in week 1 against Seattle. There is most certainly risk there, but to me, I see a lot of upside just as much. And considering how bullish most people are on wide receivers at this point in time, those later round running backs, I think, are going to have extreme value for us this year. Now moving over to the RB2, and that is Samaje Perine. I think with a 12-point floor, he becomes an absolutely elite handcuff option this year. But I mean, realistically, that's highly dependent upon Javonte Williams' health, in my personal opinion. Moving over to the wide receiver 1, and I don't think it's going to be the guy that everyone's expecting it to be, Jerry Jeudy. Steve Smith Sr. made some comments about this kind of Broncos receiving core that I thought were very interesting. He basically indicated that Jerry Jeudy might get traded halfway through the season, and based on the deep statistics that a lot of these fantasy analysts are really looking at, they don't seem the most optimistic about a year 3 breakout from Jerry Jeudy either. Now, is it most certainly in the realm of possibility? Yes. The wide receiver 1 here absolutely dominates. Like, we realistically should be expecting about a 15 to 16 fantasy point floor from someone like Jerry Jeudy this year. But I also don't think we have a full-on established idea of who's really going to be the actual wide receiver 1 in that offense. And for me, I don't think it's going to be Jerry Jeudy, but I'm going to say that whoever the wide receiver 1 is in this offense is going to project at least 16 fantasy points at a minimum. We're going to move over to the wide receiver 2 now, because I believe that Courtland Sutton could actually end up being the true wide receiver 1 in this offense by the time we get towards the end of the season. I thought the way he could have potentially opted out of this contract and gone somewhere else was very telling. It's like he doesn't want to leave. And when you're looking at the charts for the wide receiver 2 in this offense, it's not like they're faring poorly either. Like, a 12 to 13 point floor is a little bit gross to think as like that's the bare minimum production we could see from someone like Courtland Sutton, but hey, it is definitely in the realm of possibility. And looking at the beginning of last season, I want to say he was the true wide receiver 1 in that offense, and the wheels just kind of came off. Like, that wasn't really his fault. I want to say that was just more the offensive coordinator not really working with Russell Wilson, and just things just falling apart from a chemistry standpoint. No one had the true reins over that offense, and people were just unhappy as a whole. I think you got somebody that's actually got the reins now and able to pull this kind of group together and really be able to take this team to the next step that they potentially could need to go to. Considering Jerry Jeudy's going in the 4th round and Courtland Sutton's going in the 7th, I'd rather take my chances with someone like Courtland Sutton. That's just me personally. Moving over to the wide receiver 3, Tim Patrick Jr. Yes, they did technically take Marvin Mims in the 2nd round, but that was the literal last pick in the 2nd round. And when you get a guy like Tim Patrick all the way at the end of fantasy drafts, potentially even being undrafted for some teams, that makes 0 sense to me. It makes 0 sense to me why Tim Patrick, Russell Wilson, and Sean Payton would go to a Denver Broncos playoff game together if he was not going to get playing time. Those type of events are chemistry builders to me. That makes me think that Tim Patrick is potentially going to have a really nice rebound year. Why is Tim Patrick going on a show with Steve Smith Sr.? Is it just because they're boys? Definitely in the realm of possibility. I could be easily wrong here. But Fireball Jones, I don't think he's done being hot yet. And looking at the charts, the wide receiver 3 here is typically in an uptrend. So if you're not a believer in this whole entire Sean Payton, Russell Wilson, and Joe Lombardi-led offense, then okay, yeah, disregard everything I'm saying here. But to me, I think Tim Patrick is one of the absolute most elite buys you can have right now in fantasy. But heck, if you don't want to touch him with a 10-foot pole, we'll see who's going to be regretting him by mid-season time. Because it very well could be me. But having a 10-point base projection for someone like Tim Patrick at the bare minimum makes a lot of sense. And if he ends up as the true wide receiver 2 in this offense by the time we get to mid-season, I wouldn't be too surprised. Math does not math to me if he's going to theoretically be irrelevant. Now moving over to the tight end position, Greg Dulcich. And a guy I am buying a lot of right now. We already saw some glimmers of greatness from Greg Dulcich last year with Russell Wilson, and I think we can expect that to extend in year 2. Sean Payton's already hinted as well by putting him in that Joker role. Now, does that mean that we're going to see Greg Dulcich average like 17 fantasy points per game? No. But I do think a 13 to 14 fantasy point projection makes a lot of sense for a guy like him. Which, when you think about where he's going in drafts, makes a ton of sense from a value standpoint to be buying a lot of right now. Overall, I'm actually very optimistic about this Denver Broncos team, if you couldn't tell. I also think you can get a ridiculous amount of value in the fantasy drafts right now. Could this be an absolute bust from a fantasy perspective? 100%. The big thing that makes me kind of question is the potential of the offensive line play taking a step back, but I'm not a genius when it comes to offensive lines. But I can look at the money and I can look at pieces coming in and out and I can kind of get an overall guesstimation for that. But when I'm looking at all the other factors that are kind of playing into this, I'm just like, I'm going to be buying a lot of Greg Dulcich, I'm going to be buying a lot of Tim Patrick, and I'm going to be buying a lot of Cortland Sutton. I will not be buying really any Jerry Jeudy though. Chemistry and coaches are two of the biggest things in my personal opinion. I think there's a decent chance that this team takes a big step forward, but I also think there's a chance that they don't even make the playoffs. It's really going to be a very fun season to watch if you're a Broncos fan, because it's either let's ride or we're going to fall. But as always, drop your fantasy questions down below. Let me know what you guys overall think. If you enjoyed the content, make sure you drop a like, and if you want to see exactly what we're dropping tomorrow, then I highly recommend subscribing, because we're going to be dropping a video on the Detroit Lions. As always, peace.